Then we need to understand the small church as a physical organization. Not only is the small church a spiritual entity in relationship with Christ, but it is a physical entity as well. It has an organizational function. And because of that, we need to recognize that the small church functions organizationally different than the larger church. One of the mistakes that we make in our approach to leadership in the church, especially on an organizational level, is that we make the assumption that what works in one church and in one size will work in every church of any size. But the reality is that each church is different, that each church is distinct. And certainly there are some principles that we look in terms of the church and leadership that are appropriate and apply to every leader in every church. And those are derived from Scripture. For example, we see that central to leadership is the requirement of character. And that's true not only of a large church, but of a small church. We also find that as we look in the biblical teaching of the church, that the leader, the pastor, and the leadership are to be spiritual overseers. They're to oversee the well-being of the congregation. But these are principles not only true for a small church of 50, but they're true of a mega church of 5,000 or 50,000. That we're called to that same role. But in terms of how we fulfill that role, in each individual church, there are unique aspects of leadership. A mom and pop grocery store, that's a family-run operation with just the parents, maybe one other child involved in the operation of that store, will function differently organizationally than a mega corporation such as Microsoft. That how the person leads the family store will be radically different than how a person would lead this mega corporation. And if we don't understand those distinctives, if we don't understand those distinguishing characteristics, then they'll not only result in misunderstanding and confusion, but frustration as well. The pastor will become frustrated with the people will become frustrated with the pastor, because they're leading in a way that's not appropriate to the size of the church. And so one of the purposes of this course, as we delve into the study of this whole course of the small church, is we want to look at how does the pastoral leadership function on an organizational level in the context of the small church, and how that's different than how a person will function organizationally as a leader of a large church. And so we're going to explore that in our discussion in the lessons ahead. A second thing that we need to recognize is that the small church must be understood from the context of the small church. It's important for us to start with the small church and seek to learn from it. Oftentimes our perception of the church or the small church is based upon those who have not been involved in the small church, or those who have had limited experience in the context of the small church. And as a result, their perception is distorted and biased, in which the small church is viewed negatively by them as a church that's unwilling to change, a church that does not want to be effective in ministry. And we need to recognize that we need to understand the small church. We're going to talk about this more in our next session when we deal with the whole issue of culture. Because if we're to be effective, we need to understand the culture. Not only the culture of our community, but the culture of the church and the culture of the people, so that we do not prejudge them, but rather we learn from them. So as we take this course and as we go through this course together, I trust that in the end we'll have a better understanding of how the church operates, the small church operates, and how to be effective within that context. Not trying to make it the mini mega church, but allowing it to be what God has called it to be.